You're not just feeling your own emotions, you're often feeling emotions that were never yours in the first place. And the strange part is, you've been doing this your whole life without anyone ever teaching you how to understand it. What if your emotional intensity is not a weakness, but a highly advanced form of perception? And what if there are six specific traits that can turn this overwhelming sensitivity into clarity, strength, and control? Most people misunderstand empaths. They think they're just too emotional or too sensitive. But highly aware empaths operate differently. They don't just feel more, they process more, notice more, and absorb more information from their environment than others realize. The problem has never been the depth of feeling. The problem has always been the lack of understanding of how that depth works. And once that understanding begins, everything changes. You have felt someone else's pain before they even spoke a word. You have entered a space and instantly sensed that something was off, even when everything looked normal on the surface. No one had to explain it to you, no one had to point anything out, and yet your body already knew. It was not based on logic or observation alone, but on something deeper that showed up as a quiet shift inside you. A heaviness in your chest, a tightness in your throat, or a strange emotional pressure that did not belong to your own thoughts. It felt like carrying a mood that was not originally yours, and it arrived without permission, but with full intensity. What science is slowly beginning to confirm is that this experience is not imagination or exaggeration. It is a real pattern connected to how certain nervous systems process emotional environments. Emotional intelligence, in its deepest form, is not just about understanding feelings in theory, but about sensing them in real time, often before words are ever spoken. This is why you often feel things before explanations arrive. Your system is reading signals that others overlook completely, creating an internal emotional map of the environment that is constantly updating without conscious effort. The difficult part is not the feeling itself, but the confusion that follows it. You receive emotional information, but you are rarely taught what to do with it. You absorb tension, sadness, or discomfort from others, but you are not given a structure to separate what belongs to you and what does not. Over time, this creates internal noise, where your own emotions and absorbed emotions begin to overlap. That is where exhaustion begins, not because you feel deeply, but because you are carrying emotional signals without clear interpretation or boundaries. True emotional intelligence is often misunderstood as simply being kind or emotionally expressive, but it is far more precise than that. It is the ability to accurately detect emotional states, understand how they shift, and then respond in a way that does not overwhelm your internal system. Some individuals are naturally more sensitive to this detection process. Their bodies react faster, their awareness picks up subtle changes in tone, energy, and presence, and their internal responses activate before conscious thought can even analyze the situation fully. This is where neuroscience begins to offer some explanation. Certain research suggests that empathic individuals may have heightened activity in brain systems linked to emotional mirroring. This means that when they observe others, their brains do not just recognize emotion, they partially simulate it. It is as if the nervous system is rehearsing the emotional state of others internally. This is not a flaw in the system, but an intensified version of social awareness. However, without understanding this mechanism, it can feel overwhelming and confusing instead of useful. The key difference that changes everything is not whether you feel deeply, but whether you understand what you are feeling in real time. Receiving emotion is automatic for you, but interpreting it is a learned skill. When there is no interpretation, every emotional signal feels personal, even when it is not. That is where internal suffering grows silently. The six traits that follow are not about increasing your sensitivity, because that already exists. They are about transforming that sensitivity into clarity, control, and psychological strength. The first trait is interoceptive precision, which means your body becomes a source of information rather than just sensation. Your internal system is constantly communicating through physical signals, but most people ignore these messages or only notice them when they become intense. For you, these signals often arrive earlier and more clearly, showing up as shifts in breath, tension, warmth, or pressure that seem to carry emotional meaning rather than just physical discomfort. Over time, highly aware individuals begin to notice patterns in these signals. They realize that certain body sensations appear in specific emotional environments, such as subtle tightness when someone is emotionally dishonest, or a drop in energy when entering a tense atmosphere. Instead of dismissing these sensations, they begin to pay attention to them as data. This does not mean reacting impulsively, but observing carefully what the body is trying to communicate before the mind fully understands it. The transformation happens when you stop treating these sensations as random discomfort and start treating them as information that can be examined. You begin asking yourself whether what you feel belongs to you or whether it is something you absorbed from the environment. You question whether your tension is rooted in your own thoughts or in the emotional state of someone else nearby. Over time, this practice turns overwhelming sensitivity into structured awareness, or your body becomes not a burden, but a guide. This precision of self-inquiry is what separates the empath who is constantly exhausted and confused by their own inner weather from the empath who learns to use their body as one of the most reliable instruments of perception available to any human being. Instead of being carried away by every sensation, they begin to slow down their reaction and observe what is actually happening inside them. The shift is subtle, but life-changing. It is not about suppressing what you feel, but about understanding it before it takes control. Over time, this creates a new relationship with your internal world, where sensations become signals rather than emergencies. Size. The practice itself is simple in structure, but deeply demanding in discipline. Before you respond to any strong emotional or physical sensation, you pause. You locate it in your body with attention and clarity. You name it with as much precision as you can manage, instead of using vague labels. Then you begin to ask where it came from and what triggered it. You also ask what it is trying to communicate or protect. This is not overthinking or rumination. This is somatic literacy, the ability to read your body as a system of information. For a highly aware empath, this becomes the foundation of self-knowledge and emotional stability. The second trait is called effective labeling mastery, and it focuses on the precision of emotional language. This trait builds directly on bodily awareness, but it shifts the attention into the realm of thought and words. Research in psychology shows that when people are able to clearly identify what they are feeling, their emotional intensity often becomes more manageable. Simply naming an emotion with accuracy can reduce its overwhelming effect on the mind and body. This happens because the brain begins to organize the experience instead of being flooded by it. When an emotion is labeled vaguely, such as saying, "I feel bad," the mind remains in a state of confusion. But when the feeling is identified more specifically, like recognizing a deep grief tied to watching someone you care about make a painful choice, the experience becomes clearer. The brain responds to this clarity by reducing alarm signals in emotional centers and re-engaging reasoning areas that help with perspective and decision-making. The emotion still exists, but it becomes structured rather than chaotic. Highly aware empaths often develop a much richer emotional vocabulary than the average person. Instead of relying on basic categories like happy or sad, they begin to recognize subtle differences in emotional states. They can distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between shame and guilt, between anxiety rooted in uncertainty and grief rooted in loss. They can also notice when anger is driven by fear rather than injustice, or when affection is genuine rather than transactional. This level of detail is not emotional overthinking, but emotional accuracy. The importance of this precision becomes clear when you consider what happens without it. When people cannot clearly name what they are feeling, they struggle to communicate it effectively to others. They also struggle to make decisions that align with their actual emotional reality. Instead of responding appropriately to what they feel, they react blindly or suppress their emotions entirely. This creates a sense of disconnection from their inner world, as if they are navigating complex emotional experiences without a map or guidance system. Highly aware empaths often become natural emotional translators for others. Because they can identify subtle differences in feeling, they help people move from confusion into clarity. Someone might say they feel off or weird, and the empath can gently help them explore what that actually means in more specific terms. This ability makes them a source of emotional grounding for others, not because they fix problems directly, but because they bring language and structure to experiences that were previously undefined. The third trait is emotional boundaries as architecture, not walls. This is one of the most important distinctions for any empath to understand because it changes how they relate to emotional overload. Many people assume boundaries mean shutting others out completely or becoming emotionally distant. But for an empath, this approach does not work because their sensitivity cannot simply be turned off. Emotional information continues to be received regardless of intention, which means suppression only leads to internal buildup. A wall is a defensive structure. It is created in reaction to emotional pain, with the goal of blocking everything out. It says that nothing can come in, which may sound protective, but in reality, it also blocks meaningful connection. It often leads to emotional numbness or disconnection from others. For empaths, this approach eventually fails because their nervous system remains active and responsive even when they try to shut things down. Architecture, on the other hand, is intentional and structured. It does not try to prevent emotion from entering, but instead organizes how that emotion is processed. It creates internal systems that help categorize, interpret, and release emotional input in a healthy way. Instead of resisting what is felt, it acknowledges it and decides where it belongs within the internal system. This creates clarity rather than resistance. At the center of this architectural approach is a simple but powerful question. You begin to ask whether what you are feeling actually belongs to you or whether it has been absorbed from someone else. This question becomes a grounding tool in emotionally intense environments. It allows you to pause and separate your internal state from external emotional influences before reacting. Over time, this prevents emotional overload and confusion. Highly aware empaths often learn this distinction through experience rather than theory. They go through periods where they carry emotional weight that does not belong to them, absorbing stress, sadness, or frustration from others until it becomes overwhelming. Eventually, they begin to recognize that not every emotion they feel is personal. Some of it is environmental, some of it is relational, and some of it is simply emotional residue from interactions. Learning to separate these layers becomes essential for emotional survival. This does not mean becoming detached or uncaring. In fact, it allows for deeper presence with others because you are no longer losing yourself in their emotional states. You can be fully engaged with someone's pain without becoming consumed by it. This is the difference between empathy that drains you and empathy that remains sustainable over time. It is the ability to stay connected without losing internal stability. In practical terms, this looks like creating small transitions between emotional environments. It can be as simple as taking a moment after a conversation to reset internally before moving to the next interaction. It also involves noticing patterns in your emotional responses and identifying which situations tend to cause emotional blending. With awareness, you can prepare yourself mentally before entering such environments rather than being caught off guard. This architectural awareness also includes the understanding that you can care deeply for someone while still returning their emotional burden to them. Supporting others does not require carrying their emotional weight indefinitely. You can acknowledge their experience, be present with them, and still maintain your own internal balance. This is not emotional coldness, but emotional intelligence applied in a sustainable way. The fourth trait is social pattern recognition, which expands empathic awareness from individual emotions to entire systems of human behavior. At this level, perception is no longer limited to what one person feels, but extends to how emotions move through groups, relationships, and environments. It is the ability to see the hidden structure beneath social interactions, including power dynamics, emotional roles, and unspoken rules that shape behavior. Most people experience social situations in a reactive way. They can feel when a room is tense or when something is off, but they cannot easily trace where that feeling comes from or how it spreads between people. They sense discomfort but cannot map its source. Highly aware empaths, however, begin to notice patterns in how emotions circulate within a group. They can identify where tension originates, how it shifts between individuals, and what maintains it beneath the surface. In group settings such as meetings or families, they often pick up on subtle emotional dynamics that others overlook. They may notice who holds emotional influence, regardless of formal authority, or who consistently absorbs emotional responsibility for others. They can also sense when relationships are performing emotional connection rather than genuinely experiencing it. These observations are not based on judgment, but on heightened awareness of relational patterns. This level of perception allows them to understand not just individual emotions, but the system that produces them. They see how emotional behaviors are reinforced within groups, how certain feelings are allowed while others are suppressed, and how emotional expectations are passed between people without being spoken. This creates a deep understanding of human interaction at both visible and invisible levels. However, with this awareness comes a challenge. There is often a strong internal impulse to intervene, fix, or resolve emotional tension when it is observed. Highly aware empaths must learn the discipline of restraint, understanding that not every pattern they perceive requires immediate action. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply to observe without interference, allowing natural emotional processes to unfold without being disrupted. They have learned to ask a very specific question before they act on any emotional impulse. They pause and examine whether the urge to step in, to fix, to soothe, or to take responsibility actually comes from a place of genuine care for the other person, or whether it is born from internal discomfort with the emotional tension they are absorbing. This distinction changes everything, because one comes from clarity and love, while the other comes from unconscious overload. Without this awareness, empaths often confuse emotional responsibility with emotional reaction. But with it, they begin to see that not every strong feeling is a call to action. Sometimes it is simply information that needs to be observed, not carried or solved. This ability to separate care-driven action from discomfort-driven reaction is one of the highest forms of emotional intelligence a human being can develop. It requires honesty, restraint, and deep internal awareness. Most people act immediately on what they feel, assuming that intensity means importance. But highly aware empaths learn to slow down that assumption. They recognize that emotional intensity does not always equal external responsibility. Sometimes what feels urgent is actually internal processing, not external instruction. And learning to pause in that moment creates space where wisdom can enter.
That space is where emotional maturity begins to replace emotional compulsion. The fifth trait is compassionate detachment, and it holds a paradox that many people struggle to understand. It is the ability to remain fully present with another human being's emotional world while still maintaining a strong and stable sense of self. It is not emotional distance and it is not emotional absence. Instead, it is deep engagement without emotional merging. You are there, you are open, you are attentive, but you do not lose your internal ground in the process.
This creates a form of presence that is both deeply human and deeply stable at the same time, which is rare in a world that often confuses empathy with emotional absorption. This kind of presence allows a person to care completely without becoming consumed by what they care about. It is the difference between feeling with someone and becoming their feeling. In most cultural understandings of empathy, depth is often associated with losing boundaries. But in mature emotional intelligence, depth is actually made possible by structure. The more stable your internal system becomes, the more safely you can engage with intense emotional experiences without being overwhelmed by them. This is where real strength in emotional awareness begins to emerge. When all the earlier traits are integrated, compassionate detachment stops being a technique and becomes a natural state of being. With interoceptive precision, you know where you end and another person begins.
With emotional labeling, you can identify what belongs to you and what does not. With emotional architecture, you have internal structure that prevents emotional flooding. With social pattern recognition, you understand the dynamics at play without becoming lost in them. All of this creates a foundation where you can be fully present without losing yourself, which is the essence of grounded empathy. This state allows a person to offer something rare to others. They become a stable presence in emotional chaos. People around them feel seen without feeling judged, understood without feeling analyzed, and supported without feeling controlled. There is a quiet strength in this kind of presence that does not rely on advice or solutions. It relies on steadiness. And that steadiness communicates safety to others in a way that words alone cannot achieve. It is the kind of emotional safety that allows others to relax into their own experience without fear of being overwhelmed or dismissed.
Compassionate detachment also challenges a deep internal belief that many empaths carry. It is the belief that love requires emotional fusion, that caring deeply means carrying everything, and that true presence means dissolving boundaries. But in reality, this belief often leads to exhaustion and emotional confusion. It turns care into overload and presence into depletion. Releasing this belief does not reduce love. Instead, it refines it into something more sustainable and more honest, where connection is maintained without self-erasure. What defines this trait is not the role itself, but the source from which action arises. Purposeful emotional contribution only becomes stable when it is built on self-responsibility. Without that foundation, emotional sensitivity can easily turn into overgiving, where a person constantly empties themselves in an attempt to help others. This often leads to exhaustion, resentment, or emotional burnout.
Many empaths discover this pattern through difficult experiences where their desire to help exceeds their capacity to sustain themselves. True contribution begins when giving comes from fullness rather than depletion. It is the difference between offering something because you are internally resourced versus offering something because you cannot tolerate discomfort in others. One leads to sustainability and strength, while the other leads to collapse over time. Highly aware empaths learn to recognize this difference through experience and reflection. They begin to understand that helping others is most effective when it does not come at the cost of their own stability. In the end, everything comes back to one simple truth. What you once experienced as too much feeling was never a flaw in your nature. It was a form of awareness that was never properly understood, guided, or structured. You were never meant to shut it down.
You were meant to learn how to hold it, how to interpret it, and how to direct it with clarity instead of confusion. The journey is not about becoming less sensitive to the world, but about becoming more steady within what you already sense so deeply. When you bring together all of these traits, something powerful begins to form. Your awareness becomes clearer, your emotions become more readable, your boundaries become stronger, and your presence becomes more grounded. You stop absorbing everything without awareness, and instead start understanding what is yours to carry and what is not. You begin to respond to life instead of simply reacting to it. And in that shift, emotional depth stops being overwhelming and starts becoming meaningful. What changes most is not the world around you, but your relationship with it. You no longer move through life as someone being constantly affected by every emotional current.
You move through it as someone who can observe, understand, and choose how to engage. This is where emotional intelligence becomes real, not as an idea, but as a lived experience. And so the final understanding is this: your sensitivity was never the problem. The lack of structure around it was. Once that structure is built, what once felt heavy begins to feel clear. What once felt confusing begins to feel understandable. And what once felt like too much begins to feel like a strength that can finally be carried with confidence, awareness, and control.